Hello everyone! On today's episode of Tinkering with Terrius, we are going to be looking at the performance of the Ryzen build. So I decided to do some benchmarking on it. Unfortunately, I don't have a bunch of different hardware to do benchmarks with so that I can compare this to them, but I do have my old FX8350 system, and that's the system I was using before this one to do all my video editing and rendering. So I will be doing all of the benchmarks on the new Ryzen system as well as on the 8350 system. This way we should get some points of data and a way to see kind of how much performance the new system has over the old system. The new system is using a Ryzen 7 2700X at stock frequency with XFR to boost the cores, with 16 GB of 3200 MHz DDR4 RAM. The old system is using an 8-core AMD FX8350 running at 4.3 GHz. with 32 GB of 1600 MHz DDR3 RAM. Both systems are using HD 7970 GHz edition graphics cards from Gigabyte. For benchmarking, I decided to use a mix of synthetic and real-world tests. This new system is primarily designed to do all of my video editing work, so I wanted to make sure to compare its performance in DaVinci Resolve and Handbrake with the old system. In addition, I also ran the Blender BMW CPU Render and of course Cinebench and Geekbench. For gaming benchmarks, I decided to use 3D Mark, GTA 5 in DirectX 11 mode, Rise of the Tomb Raider in DirectX 12 mode, Deus Ex Mankind Divided in DirectX 11 mode, and Ashes of the Singularity in both DirectX 12 and Vulkan. All of the frame times for the games were captured with OCAT, then formatted so that FRAFs could analyze them. The scores will be represented with 0.1% low frame rate, which is the slowest 0.1% of frame times, 1% low frame rate, which is the slowest 1% of frame times, and average frame rate. This will hopefully give us an idea of how smooth the gameplay was. Since my goal was to benchmark the CPU performance of both systems and not so much the GPU performance, I first ran through all of the games at 1080p high settings, and then I ran through a second time with 1080p low settings. The hope being that the low quality scores would show the variance in CPU performance while lessening the GPU impact on the scores. Meanwhile, the high settings would show the expected performance when maxing out the 7970 GPU. Our first graph is the DaVinci Resolve 15 performance. This test was done with the same settings that I normally render out my videos with, and it was done on the Tinkering with Terrius episode 41 video. You can see from the graph that the new system rendered the same project 5.5 minutes faster than the old one, or roughly 65% faster. Second here we have the Handbrake test, and this was done with the resulting file from the DaVinci test. I often use Handbrake to trim down the file size and make it less tedious to upload to YouTube. You can see from this graph that the new system shaved roughly 5 minutes off of the Handbrake transcode time, or about 62% faster than the old system. Next up we have the Blender BMW CPU Render test. This can be downloaded directly from the Blender website, so if you want to try it out, you most certainly can. This was probably the most impressive of all the tests, just showing off how much more powerful the extra 8 threads from the 2700X are. This shows a huge 17-minute improvement over the old system, or 78% faster. Now we have the Geekbench score. In blue we have the single-threaded performance, and in red we have the multi-threaded performance. Geekbench does a variety of quick tests to simulate common system tasks, including encryption and decryption and all sorts of other things. In this test, the higher score is the better score, and the new system performed 45% better in single-threaded tests, as well as 57% better in multi-threaded tests. Finally, for the non-gaming benchmarks, we have Cinebench. Cinebench is a synthetic rendering benchmark. For the Cinebench test, I decided to include my Intel 3770K. With this graph, you can see that the 2700X really excels in multi-threaded workloads, pulling a 60% improvement over the 3770K and a 64% improvement over the 8350. In single-threaded performance, it is still a huge 44% jump over the old 8350, but only a 19% jump over the Intel 3770K. So now let's move on to some gaming benchmarks. First up, we have the 3D Mark scores. In order to not have the GPU influence the 3D Mark testing, I opted to only run the CPU-based tests. So this means that we ran the Firestrike physics test and the TimeSpy CPU test. In the Firestrike physics test, you can see that the Ryzen system performed 59% better than the 8350. This gap was even more substantial in the TimeSpy test, where the Ryzen performed a stunning 87% better than the 8350. This really shows off the true potential of a properly threaded DirectX 12 implementation. So next up we have GTA 5. For GTA 5, I ran the built-in benchmark and captured the final portion of the benchmark, starting just as the jet passed under the bridge and stopping just after the final explosion. Our first graph shows the performance in high settings. The new system averaged 105 frames per second with 1% lows of 73 frames per second and 0.1% lows of 68 frames per second. This is quite a bit higher compared to the 8350's score. The 8350 got 66 frames per second average with 44 frames per second 1% and 42 frames per second 0.1% lows. For the low quality settings, you can see an obvious difference in CPU performance. The 8350 gains 11 FPS on average, however the 1% lows only gain 2 frames per second, and the 0.1% lows stay exactly the same. The R720-700X, on the other hand, increases by 46 frames per second on average, with 1% increasing 11 frames per second and 0.1% increasing 5 frames per second. Now we have Rise of the Tomb Raider running in DirectX 12 mode. I used the built-in benchmark and captured a section of each of the 3 portions of the benchmark and averaged these together in order to get the final results. In the high settings, it's pretty obvious that the game is being bottlenecked not by the CPU but rather by the GPU. Both CPUs have the same average, though the new system does increase by 4 frames per second over the 8350 on both 1% and 0.1% lows. This does make the game ever so slightly smoother when you're actually playing it, but it's not a huge difference. Under low settings, we see a fairly similar result, though maybe a bit more exaggerated. The game is obviously still GPU limited rather than CPU. The 1% and 0.1% lows do show an interesting difference in performance though. The 2700X gains 5 frames per second average over the 8350, 13 frames per second on the 1% lows, and 22 frames per second on the 0.1% lows. Now we have Deus Ex Mankind Divided running in DirectX 11 mode. Just like Tomb Raider, this game is obviously GPU limited by the 7970. In high settings, both systems performed identically, with any variance in the scores being in the margin of error. With the low settings though, we see a familiar scene unfold. The average frame rate increases slightly by 8 FPS over the 8350, while the 1% and 0.1% lows increase more substantially by 15 FPS. And lastly here we have the Ashes of the Singularity benchmarks. These were run in both DirectX 12 and Vulkan, capturing the first 2 minutes worth of frame times. First up is the DirectX 12 graph. In the DirectX 12 test, the 2700 averaged 24 FPS more than the 8350, with 1% lows 22 FPS higher and 0.1% lows 21 FPS higher. The Vulkan scores are nearly identical, with the same difference in average FPS and 1% lows, but a much larger variance in the 0.1% lows. So needless to say, the new system is quite powerful when it comes to CPU performance. So the only things that are holding it back are the really old 7970 GPU and the stock heatsink from AMD. The AMD Wraith Prism CPU cooler is fairly decent, however, in order to get proper cooling out of it, it has to run above 3000 RPM. This unfortunately means it's a very noisy cooler when running at maximum, which was about 3700 RPM, and unfortunately even at that speed it isn't able to keep up with a fully loaded 2700X CPU. When all of the cores are being used and all of the threads are being used, this puts out quite a bit of heat. The highest temperature I saw with this CPU was about 80 degrees, and that was during a Handbrake run. For gaming, for the most part, there really wasn't much heat coming out of it. It usually stays around 60 degrees Celsius. So I think if I get a beefier CPU cooler, that should help out the performance in the rendering side of things and the more CPU heavy loads by quite a bit. Unfortunately, I don't think it will have much influence on the gaming performance. The gaming performance of the 2700X in the system is pretty much completely GPU bottlenecked. The CPU was rarely over 40% load. Most games were only using it at 20% load. So there is a chance that getting a new CPU cooler might improve the gaming performance, just because the XFR may be able to boost up the CPU cores that are actually being used by the game to a higher frequency. Better cooler might make it so instead of 3.9 GHz on the 4 cores that are active, it might be able to hit 4.0 or 4.1. The biggest improvement for gaming would be to get a new GPU. Unfortunately, that would not improve the rendering or the video side of things at all for this system. So it's very unlikely that I'll be getting a new GPU anytime soon. But if I do get a new CPU cooler, I'll be sure to test out the system again and see if the benchmarks change at all. Overall though, I'm very pleased with the system. It definitely exceeded my expectations. It certainly makes rendering videos a ton faster. It still boggles my mind that it's able to take videos that used to take 8 minutes to render and render them in 3 minutes. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you've enjoyed the Ryzen build series so far. If you did enjoy this video, then be sure to give it a big thumbs up. If you know anybody that might be interested in the performance of this 2700X system or the build, then be sure to share this with them. If you have any questions or comments, then definitely leave them in the section below, or email them to me or tweet them to me. If you haven't already, then be sure to subscribe to the channel and click the little bell icon to get notified whenever I post a new video. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day.